My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I am 67 years old now, retired for nearly a decade, though the work I did for 42 years still moves through my thoughts like a current beneath still water. I began my career in 1973 at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, when the tools of forensic pathology were far more rudimentary than they are today. Typewriters, film cameras, hand-drawn diagrams. The science was solid, but the technology was primitive by modern standards. I later moved to the Los Angeles County Coroner's office, where I remained until my retirement in 2015. Over those decades, I examined thousands of bodies. Some were the victims of violence. Others simply expired quietly in the night, their stories ending without drama or witness. I worked on cases that made headlines: mysterious celebrity deaths, serial killer investigations, epidemic casualties. I watched forensic science evolve from analog methods into the digital age, from rudimentary toxicology to DNA profiling. But through all of it, I remained in the same place, doing the same work, standing alone in cold rooms with the dead, searching for answers they could no longer speak aloud. The cases blur together after so many years, but some refuse to fade. Some linger in the mind like shadows that never quite dissolve in daylight. This is one of those cases. It happened in the autumn of 2003 in Los Angeles on a Tuesday afternoon that began like any other. I had no reason to believe that the body wheeled into my examination room that day would become something far more than a routine homicide. I had no warning that the man lying on my steel table had been watching me, studying me, carrying my photograph in his coat pocket for months. I had no idea that his death would unravel something I had spent years trying to forget. You found your way here, to this quiet corner of the past, and I appreciate that more than you might realize. Before we begin, I want you to settle in. Close your eyes if you can. Let the world around you dim. What I'm about to share with you is not a story designed to startle or shock. It is something quieter, something that unfolds slowly, like the careful peeling back of layers during an autopsy. It requires patience. It requires stillness. And it requires your full attention. Now, before we proceed any further, I must say this. If you find comfort in these late-night accounts from my years inside the morgue, you may want to stay close. More stories like this one tend to surface when you least expect them, and I hate for you to miss what comes next. So, if you wish to keep following these quiet journeys through the shadows of history, feel free to subscribe. And if this kind of story resonates with you, a simple like helps more than you know. Now, let's proceed. The day was unremarkable at first. Overcast skies, the kind of gray that sits heavy over the city without ever breaking into rain. I arrived at the office just after 7 in the morning, as I always did. The fluorescent lights in the hallway hummed their familiar tone. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold steel. I checked the intake log. One body had arrived overnight. Male, mid-40s. Gunshot wound to the chest. Found in an alley in Echo Park. No identification on him. No wallet, no keys, nothing that might tell us who he was. Just a man in a dark coat, lying face down in the rain, already cold when the paramedics arrived. I had no reason to think this case would be different from the hundreds of others I have worked. But it was. And by the time I realized it, there was no turning back. The body was brought into the examination room just before 9. 2 attendants wheeled the gurney through the double doors, the wheels squeaking faintly against the tile floor. I was already gloved and gowned, my instruments laid out on the tray beside the steel table. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that pale, clinical glow that makes even the living look cadaverous. I nodded to the attendants, and they transferred the body onto the table with practiced efficiency, then left without a word. The room fell silent. It was a silence I had grown accustomed to over the years, the kind that settles in when there is no breath, no heartbeat, no movement save for the faint hum of ventilation. I stood there for a moment, looking down at the man on the table. He was perhaps 45 years old, though death often makes it difficult to judge with precision. His hair was dark, flecked with gray, and his skin had taken on that waxy pallor that comes a few hours after the heart stops. His eyes were closed. His mouth was slightly open. There was a single gunshot wound in the center of his chest, just below the sternum, the fabric of his shirt darkened with dried blood. The wound itself was neat, precise, no exit wound visible from this angle. Likely a small caliber round, close range. The kind of wound that kills quickly if it hits the right structures. I began as I always did, with the external examination. I noted his height, his weight, the general condition of his body. No obvious signs of struggle. No defensive wounds on his hands. No bruising around the wrists or neck. He had not fought back. Either he had been taken by surprise, or he had known his killer and had not expected violence. I moved slowly, methodically, dictating my observations into the microphone hanging above the table. His clothing was damp, still carrying the smell of rain and asphalt. I noted the make and style of his coat, a dark wool overcoat, well made but worn, the kind of thing a man might wear for years without replacing. His shoes were scuffed but not cheap. His jeans were plain, unremarkable. There was no jewelry, no watch, no rings. Nothing that might give me a clue to his identity. I began to remove his clothing, cutting away the shirt and coat with surgical shears, careful not to disturb the wound. The fabric peeled back slowly, revealing pale skin, a scattering of old scars across his chest and abdomen, the kind that speak of a rough life, minor injuries accumulated over time. I folded the coat and set it aside on the evidence table, intending to examine it more closely later. But something stopped me. A faint bulge in the inside pocket. I paused, glancing at the coat. It was standard procedure to check pockets during the external examination to catalog any personal effects that might help with identification. I reached into the pocket and felt the edge of something smooth and rectangular. A photograph. I pulled it out carefully, holding it by the edges, and turned it over. For a moment, I did not understand what I was looking at. The photograph was old, printed on glossy paper that had begun to fade at the edges. It showed a man standing in front of Bellevue Hospital, the building unmistakable in the background. The man in the photograph was younger, perhaps in his late 20s, wearing a white coat and holding a clipboard. His expression was serious, professional, caught in a moment of focus as he walked toward the entrance. I stared at the photograph for a long time, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The man in the photograph was me. It had been taken sometime in the mid-1970s, during my first years at Bellevue. I recognized the coat, the clipboard, even the way I held myself, shoulders slightly hunched, always in a hurry. But I had no memory of this photograph being taken. I did not know who had taken it. And I certainly did not know why this man, lying dead on my table, had been carrying it in his coat pocket. I stood there, holding the photograph, feeling something cold and unfamiliar move through my chest. It was not fear, not exactly. It was something closer to disorientation, the sudden vertigo that comes when the ground beneath you shifts without warning. I set the photograph down on the evidence table and looked back at the body. He lay there, silent and still, offering no answers. I took a breath, steadied myself, and continued the examination. But my hands were no longer quite as steady as they had been. I returned to the body, forcing myself to focus, to push past the strange unease that had settled over me. The photograph sat on the evidence table, face up, my younger self staring back at me from 3 decades in the past. I told myself it was a coincidence, some strange quirk of circumstance, perhaps a case I had worked years ago that I no longer remembered. But even as I thought it, I knew it was not true. The photograph was too deliberate. too specific. It had been taken candidly, without my knowledge, and it had been carried by this man for reasons I could not yet fathom. I continued the external examination, working my way down the body with methodical precision. I noted the condition of his hands, his fingernails, the faint calluses on his palms that suggested manual labor or regular use of tools. His fingertips were clean, no visible dirt or residue beneath the nails. I swabbed them anyway, standard procedure, and set the samples aside for analysis. I examined his arms, his legs, his feet. No tattoos. No distinguishing marks save for the scars I had already noted. He was, in every observable way, an ordinary man. Anonymous. Unremarkable. Except for the photograph. I moved to the gunshot wound, leaning in close, studying the edges of the torn fabric and the surrounding skin. The entry wound was clean, circular, with a faint ring of stippling around the edges. Powder burns. The gun had been fired at close range, perhaps a few feet, no more. The bullet had entered the chest at a slight upward angle, suggesting the shooter had been standing close, perhaps even face to face with the victim. There was no exit wound on the back, which meant the bullet was still inside the body, likely lodged somewhere in the thoracic cavity. I would retrieve it during the internal examination. I dictated my observations, keeping my voice steady, professional, the same tone I had used for 40 years. But beneath the surface, my mind was racing, turning over possibilities, trying to make sense of what I had found. Who was this man? Why had he been carrying my photograph? And why had someone put a bullet in his chest and left him in an alley in Echo Park? I stepped back from the table, removing my gloves and replacing them with a fresh pair. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just past 10. The examination had taken longer than usual, slowed by the distraction of the photograph, by the questions circling in my mind like carrion birds. I picked up the photograph again, holding it up to the light, searching for any markings, any indication of when or where it had been taken. There was nothing. Just the image, faded but clear, of a young doctor walking toward the entrance of Bellevue Hospital on a day I could no longer remember. I set it down and returned to the body. The internal examination would take several hours, and I needed to focus. I needed to do the work I had been trained to do, regardless of what personal unease I might be feeling. I made the Y incision, the scalpel moving smoothly through skin and subcutaneous tissue, opening the chest and abdomen in the traditional manner. The ribs came away with a faint cracking sound, exposing the organs beneath. I worked carefully, methodically, examining each structure in turn. The heart was still, the chambers empty, the muscle tissue pale and firm. I located the bullet almost immediately. It had entered the left ventricle, tearing through the myocardium and lodging itself in the posterior wall. Death would have been rapid, perhaps a matter of minutes, as the heart filled with blood and the victim went into shock. I removed the bullet with forceps, holding it up to the light. A small caliber round, likely a .22 or .25, the kind of weapon that is easy to conceal and quiet when fired. I placed it in an evidence container and labeled it, then continued the examination. The lungs were clear. The liver, kidneys, and spleen showed no signs of disease or injury. Toxicology samples were taken, blood and urine, to be sent to the lab for analysis. Everything was routine. Everything was by the book. But the photograph sat on the evidence table, and I could not stop thinking about it. By the time I finished the internal examination, it was nearly 2 in the afternoon. I closed the body, stitching the incisions with the same careful precision I had used for decades, and covered it with a sheet. I stripped off my gloves and gown, washed my hands in the sink, and stood there for a moment, staring at my reflection in the polished steel of the faucet. I looked older than I felt, the lines around my eyes deeper, the gray in my hair more pronounced. I looked like a man who had spent too many years in rooms like this, surrounded by death and silence. I dried my hands and walked over to the evidence table. The photograph lay there, waiting. I picked it up and turned it over, examining the back. There, in faint pencil, barely visible, was a date. November 12th, 1976. I felt something tighten in my chest. November 1976. I had been at Bellevue for 3 years by then, still learning, still finding my footing in the world of forensic pathology. I searched my memory, trying to recall anything significant about that time, any case or event that might explain why someone had taken this photograph. Nothing came to mind. It had been an ordinary month, as far as I could remember, filled with the usual rotation of cases, the usual long hours in the morgue. I slipped the photograph into an evidence bag and sealed it, then gathered the rest of the items I had cataloged during the examination. The coat, the bullet, the swabs, the toxicology samples. Everything would be sent to the appropriate departments for further analysis. But I knew, even then, that the answers I was looking for would not come from a lab report or a fingerprint database. The answers were somewhere else, buried in the past, in a time and place I had long since left behind. I filed my report, submitted the evidence, and left the examination room. The hallway was empty, the fluorescent lights casting their pale glow across the tile floor. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and I could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the walls of my carefully ordered world had begun to crack, letting in something dark and unfamiliar. I did not know it then, but that was only the beginning. I spent the rest of the afternoon at my desk, reviewing case files and trying to focus on the routine work that filled my days. But my mind kept drifting back to the photograph, to the man lying in the morgue with my face in his pocket. I pulled up the intake report on my computer, scanning the details again. John Doe. No identification. Found at approximately 3 a.m. by a sanitation worker making his rounds. The police had canvassed the area, interviewed witnesses, but no one had seen or heard anything. The alley where he was found was narrow and dark, the kind of place where people went to disappear, either by choice or by force. There were no security cameras in the vicinity, no businesses that might have recorded footage. It was, in every practical sense, a dead end. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes, trying to think. The photograph suggested a connection, a link between this man and my past. But what kind of connection? Had he been following me? Watching me? And if so, for how long? The date on the back of the photograph was from 1976, nearly 30 years ago. Had he been carrying it all this time, or had he only recently acquired it? And why? I opened a drawer in my desk and pulled out a small notebook, the kind I used to jot down observations and thoughts that did not fit neatly into official reports. I wrote down the date from the photograph, November 12th, 1976, and underlined it. Then I wrote a single question. Who took this photograph? I sat there for a long time, staring at the question, knowing that I did not have an answer. The phone on my desk rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. I picked it up. It was Detective Sarah Callahan, one of the homicide investigators I worked with regularly. Her voice was brisk, professional. She wanted to know if I had finished the autopsy on the John Doe from Echo Park. I told her I had, and I gave her the basics. Single gunshot wound to the chest. Close range. Death within minutes. No identification on the body. Then I hesitated, and I told her about the photograph. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her tone had changed, the briskness replaced by something more cautious. She asked if I was certain it was me in the photograph. I told her I was. She asked if I had any idea who the victim was, or why he might have been carrying it. I told her I did not. Another pause. Then she said she would come by the office in the morning, and we would go over everything together. She told me not to worry, that there was probably a simple explanation. but I could hear the doubt in her voice, the same doubt I was feeling. We ended the call, and I sat there in the silence, the notebook open in front of me, the question still unanswered. I left the office just after 6, stepping out into the cool evening air. The sky was still overcast, the light fading quickly, casting the city in shades of gray and charcoal. I walked to my car, got in, and sat there for a moment, my hands on the steering wheel, staring out at the parking lot. I felt unmoored, adrift in a way I had not felt in years. My work had always been a constant, a steady anchor in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. But now, that anchor felt less secure. I drove home through the familiar streets, the traffic thick and slow, the city moving around me in its usual restless rhythm. I lived alone in a small house in Silver Lake, a quiet neighborhood where I could retreat from the noise and chaos of the coroner's office. I parked in the driveway, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. The house was dark and silent. I turned on a lamp in the living room, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and sat down on the couch. I took a sip, letting the warmth spread through my chest, and I closed my eyes. I tried to remember November 1976. I tried to recall anything unusual, any case or person that stood out. But memory is an imperfect thing, especially when you are trying to reach back across decades. The cases from that time had blurred together, a long procession of bodies and reports and court testimonies. I remembered the feel of it, the exhaustion, the constant pressure to keep up with the workload. But the specifics had faded, worn smooth by time. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. The photograph had been taken without my knowledge. That much was clear. Someone had been watching me, close enough to capture that moment outside Bellevue, close enough to see the expression on my face, the way I walked, the way I held the clipboard. It was an intimate kind of surveillance, unsettling in its focus. And now, decades later, a man had died carrying that photograph. The implications were obvious, even if the details remained obscure. I finished the whiskey and set the glass down on the coffee table. I should have felt tired. I should have felt the weight of the day settling over me, pulling me towards sleep. But instead, I felt alert, my mind turning over the problem again and again, searching for a pattern, a connection, anything that might make sense of what I had found. I got up and walked to my study, a small room at the back of the house where I kept my books and old case files. I had not looked at those files in years, but I knew they were there, boxed up and stacked in the closet. I opened the closet and pulled out the boxes, setting them on the floor. The files were organized by year, and I found the one labeled 1976 without much difficulty. I opened it and began to sift through the reports, my eyes scanning the names, the dates, the brief summaries of each case. Most of them were unremarkable. Overdoses, suicides, traffic accidents, the routine work of a busy city morgue. But then, near the bottom of the stack, I found something that made me stop. A case file from November 1976. A homicide. A man in his early 30s, found dead in his apartment in Brooklyn. Single gunshot wound to the chest. No identification on the body. I stared at the file, my pulse quickening. The similarities were impossible to ignore. I pulled the file out and carried it over to the desk, spreading it open under the lamp. The victim's name had been listed as unknown at the time of the autopsy, but a fingerprint match had later identified him as Thomas Brennan, a low-level criminal with a history of petty theft and drug offenses. He had been found in his apartment by a neighbor who reported a foul smell. The body had been there for several days before anyone noticed. I scanned the autopsy report, looking for details. Single gunshot wound to the chest. Close range. No exit wound. The bullet had been recovered during the autopsy, a small caliber round, .22 or .25. The cause of death was listed as exsanguination and cardiac arrest. The case had been classified as a homicide, but no suspects were ever identified, and the investigation eventually went cold. I sat back in my chair, staring at the report. The similarities were striking. 2 men, decades apart, both killed with a single gunshot wound to the chest at close range. Both found with no identification. Both shot with a small caliber weapon. It could have been a coincidence. But I did not believe in coincidences, not when it came to death. I flipped through the rest of the file, looking for any additional notes or follow-up reports. There was nothing. Just the autopsy report, a few crime scene photographs, and a brief summary from the detective assigned to the case. The photographs showed a small, cluttered apartment, the victim lying on the floor near the kitchen. There was no sign of struggle, no defensive wounds. The scene was eerily calm, as if the man had simply been standing there when the bullet struck. I picked up one of the photographs and held it closer to the light. The victim's face was turned away from the camera, but something about the angle, the posture, felt familiar. I set the photograph down and picked up another one, this one showing the victim's hands. And then I saw it. In one of the photographs, partially visible in the background, was a bulletin board hanging on the wall of the apartment. Pinned to the board were several papers and photographs. And among them, barely visible in the grainy image, was what looked like a photograph of a man in a white coat. I reached for a magnifying glass from the desk drawer and held it over the photograph, squinting at the image. The resolution was poor, the photograph old and faded, but I could make out enough detail to see that it was me. The same photograph, the same moment outside Bellevue Hospital. November 12th, 1976. My hands began to tremble. I set the magnifying glass down and leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my breathing. The photograph had existed in 1976. It had been pinned to the bulletin board in Thomas Brennan's apartment. And now, nearly 30 years later, the same photograph had been found in the pocket of a dead man in Los Angeles. The connection was undeniable. But what did it mean? Why had Thomas Brennan been keeping a photograph of me? And why had this new victim, this John Doe from Echo Park, been carrying the same image? I stood up and began to pace the small study, my mind racing. 2 men, decades apart, both connected to me through a photograph I had never known existed. Both killed in the same manner. Both anonymous, or nearly so, their identities obscured by time and circumstance. I stopped pacing and looked at the file again. Thomas Brennan, a petty criminal, a man with no obvious connection to me or my work. I tried to think if I had ever heard the name before, if it had ever appeared in any of the cases I had worked. Nothing came to mind. I returned to the desk and opened my laptop, searching for any information I could find on Thomas Brennan. There was not much. A few old arrest records, a brief obituary in a Brooklyn newspaper. Nothing that explained why he had been watching me or why he had been killed. I searched for any other unsolved homicides from that period, looking for patterns, looking for anything that might link Brennan to other victims. But the records were incomplete, scattered across different databases and jurisdictions. It would take time to piece together a fuller picture. Time I did not have. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dim light of the study, the old case files spread out before me. I felt the weight of the past pressing down on me, a past I had thought was finished, closed, filed away in boxes and archives. But it was not finished. It had been waiting, patient and silent, for the right moment to resurface. And now it had. I thought about the man on my table, the John Doe with no name and no identification, carrying my photograph in his pocket like a talisman. I thought about Thomas Brennan, dead in his Brooklyn apartment, my image pinned to his wall. And I thought about the person who had taken that photograph, who had been close enough to capture that moment, close enough to see me without being seen. Who were they? And what did they want? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, and I knew that sleep would not come easily that night. I did not sleep. I sat at my desk until the early hours of the morning, poring over the old case file, searching for anything I might have missed. I read the autopsy report again, line by line, comparing it to the report I had written earlier that day. The similarities were not just superficial. They were methodical, deliberate. The same weapon, the same placement of the wound, the same lack of defensive injuries. Whoever had killed Thomas Brennan in 1976 had killed the John Doe in Echo Park in 2003. I was certain of it. But why? And why now, after so many years? I made notes, jotting down theories, connections, questions. I wrote down the names of detectives who had worked the Brennan case, wondering if any of them were still alive, still working, still available to answer questions. I wrote down the name of the building where Brennan had lived, the street, the neighborhood. I wrote down every detail I could find, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant it might seem. By the time the sun began to rise, I had filled several pages in my notebook, but I was no closer to an answer than I had been the night before. I stood up, stretched, and walked to the kitchen. I made coffee, strong and black, and stood at the window, watching the light creep over the rooftops of Silver Lake. The city was waking up, the streets filling with the first signs of life, cars and buses and people moving through their routines. But I felt separate from it, disconnected, as if I were standing on the other side of a sheet of glass, watching the world move forward without me. I finished my coffee, showered, dressed, and drove back to the coroner's office. The morning was cool and clear, the overcast skies of the previous day replaced by a pale, washed-out blue. I arrived just after 7, parked in my usual spot, and walked inside. The building was quiet, the hallways empty save for a few early arrivals. I went to my office, set my bag down, and checked my messages. There was a note from Detective Callahan saying she would be by around 9. I sat down at my desk and opened the file on the John Doe case, reviewing my notes from the autopsy. I had already submitted the evidence, but I wanted to make sure I had not overlooked anything. I wanted to be certain that when Callahan arrived, I would be able to answer her questions clearly and thoroughly. At exactly 9 o'clock, there was a knock on my door. I looked up and saw Callahan standing in the doorway, her expression serious but not unkind. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with short dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. We had worked together on dozens of cases over the years, and I trusted her judgment. She stepped into the office and closed the door behind her. Callahan sat down in the chair across from my desk, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She asked me to walk her through the autopsy again, from the beginning, and to explain exactly what I had found. I did, starting with the external examination, the gunshot wound, the lack of identification. And then I told her about the photograph. I pulled out the evidence bag and handed it to her. She took it carefully, holding it up to the light, her eyes narrowing as she studied the image. She asked if I was certain it was me. I told her I was. She asked if I had any idea who might have taken it. I told her I did not. Then I told her about Thomas Brennan. I told her about the case from 1976, the similarities between the two deaths, the photograph pinned to Brennan's bulletin board. I handed her the old case file, and she flipped through it slowly, her expression growing more serious with each page. When she finished, she set the file down on the desk and looked at me. She asked if I thought the two cases were connected. I told her I did. She leaned back in her chair, thinking. Then she asked if I had any enemies, anyone from my past who might have a reason to target me, to watch me, to collect photographs of me. I thought about it. I had spent 4 years examining bodies, testifying in court, working cases that sometimes put dangerous people behind bars. There were people who had reasons to dislike me, people who might have held grudges. but none of them fit the profile of what I was seeing here. This was not anger. This was not revenge. This was something colder, more calculated. I told Callahan I did not know. She nodded, as if she had expected that answer. Then she told me she would pull the old case file from the NYPD archives, see if there were any additional reports or evidence that might shed light on Brennan's death. She would also run a check on the John Doe's fingerprints, see if they matched anyone in the system. And she would start looking into other unsolved homicides from the same period, looking for patterns, looking for connections. She stood up, gathering the files, and told me to be careful. She told me to watch my surroundings, to report anything unusual, anything that felt out of place. She said it in a calm, matter-of-fact tone, but I could hear the concern beneath the words. I thanked her, and she left. I sat there in the silence, staring at the empty chair, feeling the weight of the situation settling over me like a heavy coat. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I worked on other cases, wrote reports, attended a meeting with the deputy coroner, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept thinking about the photograph, about the two men who had died carrying it, about the person who had taken it. I kept thinking about the date. November 12th, 1976. What had I been doing that day? What case had I been working on? I could not remember. It was just another day in a long string of days, unremarkable and forgotten. But someone had remembered. Someone had been there, watching, close enough to capture that moment, to preserve it. And now, decades later, that moment had resurfaced, tied to death and mystery. I left the office just after 5, driving home through the rush hour traffic, the city moving around me in its usual chaotic rhythm. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if unseen eyes were watching me from the cars around me, from the windows of the buildings I passed. It was an irrational feeling, I knew, but I could not shake it. When I got home, I locked the door behind me, drew the curtains, and poured myself another glass of whiskey. I sat in the living room, the lights off, the house dark and silent. I tried to think logically, methodically, the way I had been trained to think. But logic felt inadequate in the face of what I was dealing with. This was not a straightforward case. This was not a robbery gone wrong, or a crime of passion, or even a calculated murder with a clear motive. This was something else, something that reached back across decades, something that connected me to strangers in ways I did not understand. I finished the whiskey and went to bed, but sleep was slow to come. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house, the faint creaks and groans of old wood settling, the distant hum of traffic. And I thought about the photograph, about the man who had carried it in his pocket, about the bullet that had ended his life. I thought about the questions I could not answer, and I wondered if I ever would. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of cold rooms and steel tables, of faces I could not quite see, of voices whispering in languages I did not understand. And somewhere in the darkness, someone was watching, patient and silent, waiting for something I could not name. The next morning, I woke early, the remnants of uneasy dreams still clinging to the edges of my thoughts. I showered, dressed, and made coffee, trying to establish some sense of normalcy, some routine to anchor myself. But the unease remained, along beneath the surface of my thoughts. I arrived at the office just after 7, the building still quiet, the hallways empty. I went to my desk and checked my messages. There was an email from Callahan, sent late the previous night. She had spoken to a retired detective in New York, one of the men who had worked the Brennan case in 1976. He remembered the case, but only vaguely. He said it had been classified as a drug-related homicide, though there was never enough evidence to prove it. Brennan had been known to associate with some unsavory characters, and the working theory at the time was that he had crossed the wrong person. But there were no leads, no suspects, and the case had eventually been shelved. The retired detective also mentioned something else. He said there had been a few other similar cases around the same time, unsolved homicides with similar characteristics. Single gunshot wounds, close range, no identification. He could not remember the details, but he suggested Callahan look into the files from that period, see if there were any connections. I sat back in my chair, thinking, multiple victims, similar methods, all from the same period. It was beginning to look less like a coincidence and more like a pattern that had been invisible for decades, buried under the weight of time and incomplete records. But now, with the new victim, the pattern was emerging again, coming into focus. I spent the rest of the morning going through old case files, looking for anything that might fit the profile. I searched databases, made phone calls, sent emails to colleagues in other jurisdictions. It was slow, painstaking work, but I was used to that. Patience and precision were the tools of my trade. By early afternoon, I had found 3 more cases from the mid-1970s, all from the New York area, all unsolved. Each victim had been killed with a single gunshot wound to the chest. Each had been found with little or no identification. And in each case, the investigation had gone cold within a few months. I compiled the information into a single document and sent it to Callahan, along with a note suggesting we meet to discuss it. She replied almost immediately, saying she would be in my office within the hour. When Callahan arrived, she brought with her a thick file folder filled with photocopies and printouts. She sat down across from me and spread the documents out on the desk. She had found 2 more cases, both from the late 1970s, both fitting the same pattern. 7 victims in total, spanning several years, all killed in the same manner, all unsolved. She looked at me, her expression grim. She said it looked like the work of a serial killer, someone who had operated quietly, methodically, targeting victims who would not be missed, whose deaths would not generate much attention. Someone who had been careful, disciplined, patient. And then, for reasons unknown, the killings had stopped. Until now. I asked her if there were any connections between the victims, any commonalities beyond the method of death. She shook her head. The victims were all different ages, different backgrounds, different neighborhoods. Some had criminal records. Some did not. There was no obvious pattern in the selection of victims, no clear motive beyond the act of killing itself. But there was one thing, she said, that stood out. In 3 of the cases, including Thomas Brennan, investigators had found photographs of people who were not the victims. In one case, it was a photograph of a young woman. In another, a middle-aged man. In the third, my photograph. She paused, letting that sink in. She said it suggested the killer had been watching specific individuals, collecting images of them, perhaps as trophies, or perhaps as part of some larger obsession. And now, decades later, the killer had resurfaced, and I was one of the individuals they had been watching. I sat there, absorbing this information, trying to process the implications. The killer had been watching me for nearly 30 years. They had taken a photograph of me in 1976, and they had kept it, passed it on, or returned to it. And now, they had killed again, leaving the photograph as a message, a sign, a calling card. Callahan asked if I had noticed anything unusual in recent months, anyone following me, anyone showing an unusual interest in my work or my life. I thought about it, but nothing came to mind. My life was routine, predictable. I went to work, I came home, I kept to myself. I had no social life to speak of, no close relationships outside of my professional circles. If someone had been watching me, they had done so invisibly, blending into the background of my everyday existence. I told Callahan I had not noticed anything. She nodded, as if she had expected that answer. Then she told me she was assigning a protection detail, at least for the time being. She said it was a precaution, that there was no immediate threat, but given the circumstances, it was better to be safe. I did not argue. I knew she was right. Over the next few days, I became acutely aware of the presence of the protection detail. There were 2 officers, rotating shifts, one always nearby, keeping a discreet distance but always within sight. I saw them in the parking lot when I arrived at work. I saw them in the hallway outside my office. I saw them parked across the street from my house in the evenings. It should have been reassuring, but instead it made me feel more vulnerable, more exposed. It was a constant reminder that something was wrong, that the walls of my carefully ordered world had been breached. I tried to focus on my work, to maintain the routine that had always anchored me, but it was difficult. Every time I stepped into the examination room, every time I looked at a body on the steel table, I thought about the photograph, about the killer who had been watching me, who might still be watching me. I wondered if they were out there now, somewhere in the city, waiting for the right moment. I wondered what they wanted, what they were trying to achieve. Callahan continued to investigate, pulling files, interviewing witnesses, following leads that went back decades. She kept me updated, calling me every few days with new information, new theories. But the case remained elusive, the connections tenuous, the motive unclear. We were dealing with someone who had been careful, methodical, patient. Someone who had managed to kill 7 people over several years without leaving enough evidence to be caught. Someone who had then disappeared for nearly 30 years, only to resurface now, in Los Angeles, with my photograph in their victim's pocket. One evening, as I was leaving the office, Callahan called me. She said she had found something. She asked if I could meet her at the station the next morning. I told her I would. That night, I sat in my living room, the lights off, the house dark and silent. I thought about the past, about the cases I had worked, the people I had encountered. I thought about November 12th, 1976, trying once again to remember anything unusual, anything that might explain why someone had taken that photograph. But memory is unreliable, especially when you are trying to reach back across decades. The details fade, the edges blur, and all that remains is a vague sense of time passing, of days blending into one another. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat in the dark, waiting for morning. The questions remained unanswered, hanging in the air like smoke. The next morning, I met Callahan at the station. She led me to a small conference room where she had spread out a series of documents and photographs on the table. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed, but there was a sharpness to her expression, a focus that told me she had found something significant. She gestured for me to sit, and I did. She sat down across from me and slid a photograph across the table. It was old, grainy, black and white. It showed a man in his late 40s, standing on a street corner, his face partially obscured by shadow. She said the photograph had been found among the evidence from one of the old cases, one of the victims from 1978. The man in the photograph had never been identified. No one knew who he was or why his photograph had been among the victim's belongings. But something about the photograph had caught her attention, and she had run it through a facial recognition database, hoping for a match. She slid another photograph across the table. It was a more recent image, taken from a security camera outside a convenience store in Echo Park, dated 2 days before the John Doe was found. The man in the photograph was older, his face more lined, his hair thinner. But the resemblance was unmistakable. It was the same man. Callahan said the security footage showed him purchasing a pack of cigarettes and leaving. She had traced his movements from the store, following him through several other cameras in the area. He had walked to the alley where the John Doe was later found, and he had not been seen leaving. She paused, letting the implication sink in. She said she believed the man in the photograph was the killer, and she believed he was still in the area, still watching, still waiting. I stared at the photographs, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The man was a stranger to me. I had never seen him before, not in 1978, not in 2003. But he had been there, in the background of these cases, a silent presence, watching, collecting, killing. Callahan said she had put out an alert, circulating the photograph to every officer in the city. She said it was only a matter of time before someone spotted him, before they brought him in. But until then, I needed to stay vigilant, stay safe, stay with the protection detail. I nodded, but I felt a cold knot of dread forming in my chest. Because I knew, deep down, that this was not over. That the man in the photograph was not finished. And that whatever he wanted, whatever he was trying to achieve, it involved me. That night, I returned home under the watchful eye of the protection detail. The officer parked across the street, the car's presence a small comfort in the growing darkness. I went inside, locked the door, drew the curtains, and stood in the living room, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on me. I poured a glass of whiskey, but I did not drink it. I just held it, staring at the amber liquid, thinking about the man in the photographs, about the decades he had spent in the shadows, watching, waiting. I thought about the victims, 7 people whose lives had been ended with a single bullet, whose deaths had gone unsolved, whose stories had been forgotten. And I thought about myself, about the photograph taken without my knowledge, about the years I had spent in the morgue, surrounded by death, never knowing that someone was out there, keeping track of me, holding onto that image like a secret. I set the glass down and walked to the study. I pulled out the old case files again, spreading them across the desk, looking for anything I might have missed. I read through the reports, studied the photographs, compared the details of each case. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. A pattern that had nothing to do with the victims themselves, but with the timing of the deaths. Each killing had occurred on or around November 12th. The date varied by a few days, but the proximity was undeniable. November 12th, the date on the back of my photograph. I sat back in my chair, staring at the files, feeling a chill run through me. The killer had been using that date as a marker, a reference point, a ritual. And now, it was October 2003. November 12th was less than a month away. I picked up the phone and called Callahan. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the late hour. I told her about the pattern, about the dates. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she said she would pull the exact dates of all the old cases, cross-reference them, see if the pattern held. She told me to stay inside, to keep the doors locked, to not take any chances. I told her I would. We ended the call, and I sat there in the silence, the files spread out before me, the clock on the wall ticking steadily toward midnight. November 12th was coming, and I had no doubt that the killer was preparing for it, planning for it, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the study, the lamp casting a small pool of light across the desk, the rest of the house dark and silent. I kept thinking about the date, about what it meant, about why the killer had chosen it. Was it connected to the photograph? Was November 12th significant for some reason I could not see? Or was it simply a date the killer had chosen at random, a marker to give their killings a sense of order, a sense of ritual? I did not know, but I knew that time was running out. The following days passed in a haze of tension and waiting. Callahan confirmed the pattern. Every one of the old cases had occurred within a few days of November 12th. It was not exact, but it was close enough to be significant, close enough to suggest that the date held some kind of meaning for the killer. She intensified the investigation, bringing in additional officers, expanding the search for the man in the photographs. But he remained elusive, a ghost moving through the city, leaving no trail, no evidence, no sign of his presence. I continued to work, to go through the motions of my daily routine, but I felt disconnected, as if I were moving through a dream, waiting for something to happen. The protection detail remained with me, a constant shadow, but I knew that their presence could only do so much. If the killer wanted to reach me, they would find a way. It was what they did. It was what they had always done. On November 10th, Callahan called me into her office. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. She told me they had identified the man in the photographs. His name was Raymond Cole. He was 68 years old, a former orderly who had worked at Bellevue Hospital in the 1970s. He had been fired in 1977 for unspecified misconduct, and his whereabouts after that were unclear. He had moved around, working odd jobs, living in cheap hotels and boarding houses. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, nothing that would have flagged him as a suspect in any investigation. But he had been at Bellevue in November 1976. He had been there when the photograph of me was taken. Callahan said they were searching for him now, checking known addresses, interviewing people who might have seen him. But Cole had been off the grid for years, and finding him was proving difficult. She told me to be careful, to stay alert, to report anything unusual. I thanked her and left the station, the weight of the information pressing down on me. Raymond Cole, a former orderly, someone who had been in the background of my life, invisible, unnoticed, watching. I tried to remember if I had ever met him, if I had ever spoken to him, but nothing came to mind. The orderlies at Bellevue had been a constant presence, moving bodies, cleaning rooms, handling the countless small tasks that kept the morgue running. But I had never paid much attention to them. They were part of the machinery, part of the routine. And now, one of them had spent decades collecting photographs, killing people, and preparing for something I could not yet see. I drove home, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my mind racing. November 12th was 2 days away, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that Raymond Cole was coming for me. November 11th arrived, cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that refused to break. I woke early, my body tense, my mind alert, every sound in the house magnified, every shadow suspect. I went through my morning routine mechanically, showering, dressing, making coffee. But I felt like a man preparing for something inevitable, something that could not be avoided or postponed. The protection detail was parked outside when I left for work. I nodded to the officer, got in my car, and drove to the coroner's office. The streets were crowded with morning traffic, the city moving through its usual rhythm, oblivious to the tension coiled inside me. I parked and walked into the building, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the hallways filled with the familiar sounds of voices and footsteps. I went to my office, closed the door, and sat down at my desk. I tried to focus on work, on the reports waiting to be written, the cases waiting to be examined. But my mind kept drifting back to Raymond Cole, to the photograph, to November 12th. At noon, Callahan called. She said they had found Cole's last known address, a rooming house in downtown Los Angeles. Officers had gone there, but he was not there. The landlord said he had not seen Cole in several days. She said they were searching the area, checking nearby hotels, interviewing residents. But so far, there was no sign of him. I told her I would stay at the office, that I would wait for further instructions. She told me to be careful, and we ended the call. I sat there, staring at the phone, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Cole was out there, somewhere in the city, moving through the streets, invisible, patient, waiting for the right moment. And I was here, locked in a building filled with the dead, surrounded by steel and tile and fluorescent light, waiting for him to come. The hours passed slowly. I worked, I wrote reports, I answered phone calls. But my mind was elsewhere, circling the same questions, the same fears. What did Cole want? Why had he been watching me for so many years? What was going to happen on November 12th? At 5 o'clock, I left the office, walking to my car under the watchful eye of the protection detail. The sky was darkening, the light fading quickly, the air cold and damp. I drove home, the streets filled with evening traffic, the city moving around me in its usual chaotic rhythm. When I arrived home, I parked in the driveway, got out, and walked to the front door. The protection detail was parked across the street, the officer watching me from the car. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. The house was dark and silent. I turned on the lights, checked the windows, made sure everything was locked. Then I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat down in the living room, the weight of the day settling over me like a heavy blanket. I thought about Raymond Cole, about the years he had spent in the shadows, collecting photographs, killing people, preparing for this moment. I thought about the victims, about their lives cut short, about the questions that had never been answered. And I thought about myself, about the photograph taken on November 12th, 1976, about the fact that I had been a target for nearly 30 years without knowing it. I finished the whiskey and went to bed, but sleep did not come. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house, the faint creaks and groans, the distant hum of traffic. And I waited for November 12th to arrive, knowing that whatever was going to happen, it was going to happen soon. November 12th, 2003. I woke just before dawn, the room still dark, the air cold and still. I lay there for a moment, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the date pressing down on me. 27 years since the photograph was taken. 27 years since Raymond Cole had stood somewhere outside Bellevue Hospital, watching me, capturing that moment. And now, decades later, the cycle was coming full circle. I got up, dressed, and went to the kitchen. I made coffee, strong and black, and stood at the window, watching the lights slowly creep over the rooftops. The protection detail was still there, parked across the street, the officer visible in the driver's seat. I felt a small measure of comfort knowing they were there, but I also knew that if Cole wanted to reach me, he would find a way. He had been patient for decades. He would not be stopped by a single police car. I called Callahan. She answered immediately, her voice tense, alert. She said they were still searching for Cole, that every officer in the city had his photograph, that they were checking every possible location. She told me to stay home, to stay inside, to not take any chances. I told her I would. We ended the call, and I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, waiting. The hours passed slowly. Morning turned to afternoon. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but my mind kept returning to the same thoughts, the same fears. Where was Cole? What was he planning? And why had he chosen me? At 3 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Callahan. She said they had found Cole. He had been spotted near the coroner's office, standing across the street, watching the building. Officers had moved in, but he had seen them and fled. They were pursuing him now, tracking him through the streets, but he had disappeared into the maze of downtown Los Angeles. She told me to stay inside, to keep the doors locked, to not answer the door for anyone. I told her I understood. I hung up and sat there, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. Cole was close. He was in the city, moving through the streets, and he was coming for me. I stood up and walked to the front door, checking the lock, checking the windows. Everything was secure. The protection detail was still outside, the officer alert, watching the street. I went to the study and pulled out the old case files, spreading them across the desk. I did not know why. Perhaps I needed to see the pattern again, to remind myself of what I was dealing with. Perhaps I needed to understand, even if understanding would not protect me. I stared at the files, at the photographs of the victims, at the dates, at the details. And then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible, coming from the back of the house. A soft scraping, like metal against wood. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. Someone was at the back door, trying to get in. I moved quickly, quietly, across the study and into the hallway. I reached for my phone, dialing Callahan's number, but before I could press the call button, the back door swung open. Raymond Cole stepped inside. He was tall, thin, his face gaunt and lined with age. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, and they fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. He was holding a small revolver, the barrel pointed at the floor, his hand steady. We stood there, frozen in the dim light of the hallway, staring at each other. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Cole smiled, a thin, humorless expression, and he said, "Dr. Webb, it's been a long time." I did not move. I did not speak. My mind was racing, searching for options, for a way out. But there was none. Cole was between me and the front door. The protection detail was outside, unaware of what was happening inside. And Cole had a gun. He took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He said, "You don't remember me, do you?" I shook my head slowly. He laughed, a dry, brittle sound. No one ever does. I was just an orderly, just part of the machinery. Invisible. He took another step forward. "But I saw you, Dr. Webb. I saw you every day. I watched you work. I watched you cut open bodies, pull them apart, search for answers. You were so focused, so precise. You never looked up. You never saw me." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But I saw you, and I knew, even then, that you were special. That you understood something the rest of us didn't. You understood death. You understood the silence. And I wanted that. I wanted to be part of that silence." I found my voice, though it came out hoarse, strained. "Why are you doing this?" Cole tilted his head, considering the question. "Because it's time," he said. "Because the cycle has to complete." November 12th, 1976. That was the day I took your photograph. The day I decided that you were the one. And every year, on this day, I remind myself of that decision. I remind myself of what I'm working toward. He raised the gun, pointing it at my chest. 7 people have died so far. 7 reminders. 7 markers on the path. And now, it's your turn, Dr. Webb. Now, the cycle completes. I took a step back, my mind racing. I thought about the victims, about the years Cole had spent planning this moment, about the photograph he had carried for decades. I thought about the protection detail outside, about Callahan searching the streets, about the fact that no one knew Cole was here. And I thought about the fact that I was going to die. But then I heard it. The sound of footsteps on the front porch. The sound of the door opening. The protection detail had heard something, or perhaps they had simply decided to check on me. The officer stepped into the hallway, his hand on his weapon, his eyes widening as he saw Cole. Cole turned, his gun swinging toward the officer. And in that moment, I moved. I lunged forward, slamming into Cole with all the force I could muster. We crashed into the wall, the gun discharging with a deafening crack, the bullet burying itself in the plaster above our heads. The officer shouted, drawing his weapon, but Cole and I were a tangle of limbs and fury, struggling for control of the gun. I had not fought anyone in decades. My body was old, stiff, unaccustomed to violence. But adrenaline surged through me, sharpening my senses, lending me strength I did not know I possessed. I grabbed Cole's wrist, trying to wrench the gun free, but his grip was like iron. He twisted, slamming me against the wall, and I felt the air rush out of my lungs. The officer was shouting, moving closer, his weapon trained on Cole. But Cole was faster. He brought the gun around, pointing it at the officer, and fired. The shot was wild, missing the officer by inches, but it was enough to make him dive for cover. In that moment, Cole shoved me away, turned, and ran. He bolted through the back door, disappearing into the evening darkness. The officer scrambled to his feet, shouting into his radio, calling for backup, calling for units to converge on the area. But Cole was gone, swallowed by the shadows, vanishing into the city like smoke. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, my hands shaking. The officer approached me, asking if I was hurt, but I could barely hear him. My ears were ringing from the gunshots, my mind reeling from what had just happened. Raymond Cole had been in my house. He had been standing in my hallway, pointing a gun at my chest, ready to complete the cycle he had been planning for decades. And he had escaped. Callahan arrived within minutes, along with a dozen other officers. They flooded the neighborhood, searching every street, every alley, every building. But Cole was gone. He had disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the faint smell of gunpowder and the echo of his voice. I sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, a paramedic checking me over. Callahan stood nearby, her expression grim, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated the search. When she finished the call, she came over and sat down beside me. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was. She asked if I could remember everything Cole had said, every detail. I told her I could, and I did. I recounted the conversation, the way he had spoken about the photograph, about the cycle, about the 7 victims. Callahan listened, her expression growing darker with each word. When I finished, she said they would find him. She said it was only a matter of time, but I could hear the doubt in her voice, the same doubt I was feeling. Raymond Cole had spent decades in the shadows, moving invisibly through the world, killing without being caught. He had come for me, and he had failed, but I knew he would not stop. He would not give up. The cycle had to complete, and he would keep trying until it did. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews, security briefings, and sleepless nights. The protection detail was increased, officers stationed inside my house as well as outside. Callahan and her team worked around the clock, following every lead, checking every possible location where Cole might be hiding. But he remained elusive, a ghost moving through the city, leaving no trace. I tried to return to work, to maintain some sense of normalcy, but it was impossible. Every time I stepped into the examination room, every time I looked at a body on the steel table, I thought about Cole, about the gun pointed at my chest, about the cycle he was determined to complete. I could not focus. I could not work. I could not escape the feeling that he was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. 2 weeks after the incident, Callahan called me into the station. She said they had a lead. A man matching Cole's description had been spotted in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. Officers were moving in, preparing to apprehend him. She asked if I wanted to be there, to see it through. I told her I did. We drove to the motel in silence, the city passing by in a blur of lights and shadows. When we arrived, the area was already swarming with police, tactical units moving into position, surrounding the building. Callahan and I stood behind the command vehicle, watching as the officers moved in. The door to the motel room was breached with a battering ram, officers flooding inside, shouting commands. There was a moment of tense silence, and then one of the officers emerged, shaking his head. The room was empty. Cole had been there, but he was gone. He had left behind a single item, sitting on the bed. A photograph. The same photograph. The one taken on November 12th, 1976. The one that had been carried by 7 dead men. The one that had started all of this. Callahan picked it up carefully, holding it by the edges, and brought it over to me. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The message was clear. Cole was not finished. He was still out there, still planning, still waiting. And he was not going to stop until the cycle was complete. The investigation continued, but the leads dried up. Cole had vanished, disappearing into the vast, anonymous sprawl of Los Angeles. Callahan remained optimistic, insisting that it was only a matter of time before he made a mistake, before they caught him. But as the weeks turned into months, that optimism began to fade. I returned to work, slowly, cautiously, but I never felt safe. The protection detail remained a constant presence, but I knew that if Cole wanted to reach me, he would find a way. He had proven that already. I lived in a state of constant vigilance, always watching, always listening, always waiting for the next move. And then, on February 14th, 2004, it happened. I was at the office, working late, when I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was familiar, calm, almost gentle. It was Raymond Cole. He said, "Dr. Webb, I want you to know that I'm not angry. I'm not upset that you survived. In fact, I'm glad, because it means the cycle is still in motion. It means there's still time." I did not respond. I could not. He continued, "I've been thinking about it, about what it all means. And I've realized something. The cycle doesn't end with your death. It ends when you understand. When you see what I see. When you understand the silence." He paused, and I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background, the distant hum of the city. "You're a man who lives with death, Dr. Webb. You spent your entire life surrounded by it, but you've never truly understood it. You've never embraced it. And that's what I've been trying to show you. That's what this has all been about." I found my voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. "What do you want from me?" Cole laughed, that same dry, brittle sound. "I want you to remember, Dr. Webb. I want you to remember that photograph. I want you to remember that day. Because that was the day you became part of this. That was the day the cycle began. And it will continue, long after I'm gone, long after you're gone. It will continue because it has to. Because that's what death is. It's not an ending. It's a cycle. And we're all part of it." The line went dead. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, my mind reeling. Callahan arrived within minutes, tracing the call, coordinating with the officers, but it was no use. Cole had called from a payphone in a busy part of the city. By the time officers arrived, he was gone. That was the last time I heard from Raymond Cole. The investigation continued for months, but he was never found. He had disappeared completely, vanishing into the shadows from which he had emerged. And I was left with the photograph, with the memory of his voice, with the knowledge that somewhere out there, Raymond Cole was still alive, still watching, still waiting. I retired from the coroner's office in 2015, 12 years after the incident with Cole. The work had become too much, the weight of it pressing down on me like a stone. I had spent 42 years in the morgue, surrounded by death, searching for answers in the silence. But the silence had begun to feel different, heavier, more oppressive. It was no longer just the silence of the dead. It was the silence of unanswered questions, of mysteries that could not be solved, of cycles that could not be broken. I moved to a small house in the hills, away from the city, away from the noise and chaos. I thought that distance would help, that isolation would bring peace. But the photograph remained. I kept it in a drawer in my study, wrapped in plastic, sealed away. But I could not forget it. I could not forget the man who had taken it, the man who had carried it for decades, the man who had killed 7 people in its name. And I could not forget Raymond Cole. Years have passed since that night in November 2003. I am an old man now, approaching 70, my body weakened by time, my mind haunted by memories. I no longer work. I no longer search for answers in the silence. But the silence remains. It is always there, beneath the surface, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is dark and still, I think about Raymond Cole. I think about the cycle he spoke of, the pattern he was so determined to complete. I think about the fact that he is still out there, somewhere, invisible and patient, waiting for the right moment. I do not know if he will come for me again. I do not know if the cycle will ever complete. But I know this. Death is not an ending. It is a cycle, and we are all part of it, whether we understand it or not. I have spent my life surrounded by death, studying it, examining it, trying to make sense of it. But in the end, I have learned only this. Death is patient. It is relentless. And it is always watching, waiting for the right moment to claim us all. Raymond Cole understood that. He understood it in a way that I never did, in a way that I never wanted to. And perhaps that is the answer I have been searching for all these years. Not an answer that brings comfort, or closure, or peace, but an answer that reminds me that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some cycles are meant to continue, and some silences are meant to be eternal. I live with that knowledge now. I live with the photograph, with the memory of Cole's voice, with the understanding that somewhere out there, the cycle is still in motion. And I wait, just as Raymond Cole waited, just as the dead have always waited, in the silence,